As we finished The Black Cauldron, something happened of a very significant nature at Disney Studios. There was a period of time where it looked like Disney was going to be taken over corporately by corporate raiders. It was on everybody's minds. We would talk about it every day. And ultimately what happened was Roy Disney Jr., he had been kicked out of the studio by the management that was currently running the studio. Or he had been forced to leave, let's put it that way. Kicked out is a little too strong, but he had been forced to leave, and he had left. And then secretly, he had orchestrated his return. He did it masterfully, and when he came back, he brought with them Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg to run the studio. And Roy was going to personally run the animation department with Jeffrey Katzenberg. Jeffrey Katzenberg, one of his first decisions upon coming to Walt Disney Studios was to remove the animation department from the animation building. The building that Walt had built for us, the building where all these incredibly wonderful movies had been produced.
Bruce Block.
So we were being given our marching orders that we were going to move into a warehouse building a few miles away from the main studio, and that's where we were going to make The Great Mouse Detective. And it was a very uncertain time for us animators. Jeffrey Katzenberg had made it very clear that he really wasn't interested in us as an entity. And by making us move out of our building, our home, it left us feeling very uncertain about our future. The original animation building on the lot was just the coolest place to come to work every day. My actual office at that time was Ub Iwerks' old office. Ub Iwerks, for those that don't know, animated Steamboat Willie, Mickey Mouse and Steamboat Willie, and invented the multi-plane camera. He was a animation genius. So there was all this history there. When I first started in 1977, the linoleum floors in the animation building were the very same original linoleum floors that Walt had walked on, and they hadn't been torn up yet. They eventually would, and we didn't like that. Even though they were ugly, it was the original linoleum floors. So there was all this history there. All the greats had worked there, and we loved being there. So when Jeffrey Katzenberg made us move, it was not a fun time. So one day, I had already moved, I think, over to what we called the Flower Street building. Mark and I got over there early, and it was not a great place to be, the Flower Street building, because half the building was still under construction. And we were experiencing some cold days, and Mark remembered more than I did. We were talking not long ago about how cold it was in that building. He would literally spend his days with his winter coat on, animating at his desk. That's how cold it got. But we'd have to come back to the main lot because a lot of the studio, a lot of our staff were still there. So you come back for a meeting or something. And one day I'm walking down the hallway of the first floor of the animation building, and this man is walking towards me, and I recognize him as Michael Webster. I had met Michael Webster in my days working for Abe Levito at the Walter Lantz building. Michael Webster was then an art director for a large advertising agency that we were doing work for. And I had subsequently had lunch with Michael Webster, and he had gotten to know me a little bit, and I had gotten to know him. And he was newly hired by Disney to help start up and create what Michael Eisner wanted, which was a newly created Disney television animation unit. And he saw me and recognized me and immediately invited me to come talk to him in his office. He said, I need someone like you to go to Japan. We are going to be setting up an animation department, and the production of the show is going to be produced in Japan. We're going to subcontract out a studio, and I need someone with feature animation skills to go over and instruct and supervise our first Saturday morning cartoon television show. So that was coming right after Jeffrey Katzenberg had moved us out of our animation building. Great Mouse Detective looked like it was going to be a definite step in the right direction after having done Black Cauldron, which was a big step in the wrong direction. But this idea of getting in on the ground floor of a department of animation newly created that Michael Eisner wants to do felt like it had much more future than the uncertainty that I was feeling and we all were feeling at Features. So I took the job. It was a very difficult decision to make because I was lined up to be a supervising animator on The Great Mouse Detective. But there was so much promise and so much opportunity to get in on something so new and so exciting that I decided to take it. And I was the only person from feature animation who was approached. And ultimately, I would go and live in Japan for 6 months and supervise what would become Disney's first successful Saturday morning cartoon show called Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears, which has nothing to do with the candy whatsoever. It had to do with the fact that Michael Eisner liked gummy bears and so insisted that our show, regardless of what it was about, had to have that title. And it has nothing to do with the candy. It has to do, the story is like taking the 7 dwarves and Sword in the Stone and making the dwarves bears and putting the two together, and you end up with Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears. I had a great time in Japan. It was very artistically rewarding. And I think what I experienced more than anything else was that when you're at Disney Features, everybody is great. Everybody is so talented that unless you're Glenn Keane, you don't stand out from the rest. And as long as you're going there each and every day, you have no sense of how much you've learned and how much you've accomplished compared to the rest of the animation world. You are surrounded by the very best. So getting to Japan and getting outside of the confines of feature animation gave me my first realization of how much I had learned through Eric Larson and the people around me. Whereas while I was in Features, I had nothing to compare it to. Everybody's good there. No, Gummy Bears was really, really sharp. It was really ambitious. In fact, I told Michael Webster at the time, there was a Christmas party in 1984. I was like one of the very earliest people signed on to come to Disney TV. There was a Christmas party, and Michael Webster took me into a back bedroom and said, here's the pilot, here's the outline for the show, not the pilot, but here's the outline. And I read it, and I said, Michael, you're out of your mind. I said, this is way too ambitious. Are you nuts? And I basically said, it's the 7 Dwarfs meets Sword in the Stone. For TV, you can't produce something as complex as this. And he just ignored me, and rightfully so. And he said, well, that's what I'm putting you on. And God, it was a great show. It had so many layers to it. Shows today are can't even hold a candle to the layers of story that were in Gummi Bears. It was just way ahead of its time. We ultimately did 65 episodes. I was the overseas supervisor for the first season, and part of the second season. Michael would have wanted me to go back over and over and over again. I said, absolutely not. But it took him 6 weeks into the second season to find a replacement for me. So I did go for 6 weeks and get the second season going. Then they put me on DuckTales. They made me a director. They rewarded me for success as an overseas supervisor, and I got promoted to director, which was a huge thing. It was, again, another big career thing for me. DuckTales was a blockbuster hit. Made the Walt Disney Studios a fortune. And it was our first show into syndication. We had broken new ground. I came back from Japan. I had been introduced to what the rules of producing Saturday morning were that Hanna-Barbera had set up years before. And I was determined to break every one of those rules and set it up differently so that Gummi Bears would never look like a Hanna-Barbera show. And one of the things was I set up a very complex set of mouths for the characters, because all Saturday morning stuff was being animated overseas by people who didn't speak English. And so mouth charts had to be set up, a whole series of mouth charts. And Hanna-Barbera was basically working with 5 mouths complete. And I was determined to not do that. And so I set up a Disney set of mouths that I think, I don't know how many I had. I had a lot, especially by TV standards. And one of the things that I got when I came back from Japan was a lot of phone calls from people at other studios asking me how in the hell I got lip sync so good on the Gummi Bears. And that was really nice. And I just continued. What I wanted out of Saturday morning was there was Disney features and everybody else. And if the bar for everybody else doing a feature, as rare as that would be, there weren't very many studios doing features back in the early 80s. But if a studio put out a feature, and we would be talking about Ralph Bakshi was doing features back then, his level was somewhere here, and Disney Features was up here. I wanted the same gap to be there between what Disney was doing on Saturday morning and what everybody else was doing. I wanted to maintain that gap, and Gummi Bears succeeded in that. And then we conquered the syndication market with DuckTales. That was a huge hit. Then I came off of that, and they asked me to sort of co-direct The New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, which was our first time. We had dabbled with Donald Duck in DuckTales. That was a very delicate thing because Donald was one of the sacred cows. And so we only had Donald in a few episodes of DuckTales. So Winnie the Pooh was also a sacred character, and they wanted to make sure that they didn't screw it up. So I was the producer director of that was a guy who all of his talents were focused on writing, and so they had me in there to make sure that the production and the animation and storyboards were good. And so I spent one season on the opening season of New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, and then I immediately asked to be the director of the new seasons for Gummi Bears. I wanted to get back to Gummi Bears because I had co-created that show. It was very dear to my heart, and the show was now moving into its 4th season, and I wanted to be the one to do 4, 5, and 6, and I did. And I had a great time on that. I had a great crew. We kind of revamped the show a bit. As we finished up Gummi Bears for the final time, and I want to point out that the voices we had in Gummi Bears were, some of them were June Foray, Lorenzo Music, Paul Winchell, Corey Burton, Jim Cummings. We had some of the all-time greats as voices on that show. But as we finished up, Roger Rabbit had been released to, tremendous success. It was a phenomenon, and it really was a great movie. And our president, not Michael Webster, he had this bad idea to capitalize on the success of Roger Rabbit with a show, with an idea called Bonkers. And you have to understand, if you've never seen Roger Rabbit, the clever, unique moments of Roger Rabbit is you have cartoon characters living in a live action world. There are live action people interacting with cartoon characters. That's what made Roger Rabbit so special, and it was done so well. Well, Gary knew that TV didn't have the budget to do a TV show where you got cartoon characters interacting with live action. So he had this idea that we'll have cartoon characters that look like people interacting with cartoon characters, and the public will understand that the cartoon characters that look like people are supposed to be real people, like they were in Roger Rabbit, and it'll be great. It'll be great. And we couldn't make them understand, no, Gary, they're going to accept them as cartoon characters. The whole uniqueness, the whole concept is bogus. Your concept is not going to fly. Well, he wouldn't hear of it. So we were going to do this show called Bonkers. At the very same time as Bonkers was getting developed, Michael Eisner buys a studio in Paris that's being run by 2 Italian men named Paul and Gaetan Brizzi. They're a wonderful studio, tremendous talent there, and Michael Eisner, just kind of on a whim, buys the studio. Well, having bought it, he doesn't know what to do with them. Had no plan after buying them of what they were going to do. And features animation doesn't move quickly on things like that. You can't just say, oh my God, we just bought this studio, feature animation, send them a sequence. It doesn't work that way over at Features. So Michael Eisner calls Gary Kreisel up and said, I just bought a studio in Paris. I'm going to give you 2 weeks to come up with something to give them. I need something for them to do. They're costing me money. I'm paying them, and they're sitting around twiddling their thumbs. So Gary Kreisel pulls the directors together in TV, and I was included, and says, we got to come up with something right away to give the Paris studio. We're working on this Bonkers thing. Michael Eisner says we can do a theatrical feature, a theatrical short. A short 7-minute cartoon like a Bugs Bunny cartoon or something like that. And we're going to give it to Paris. They're going to produce it for us. And we got to come up with something right away, like tomorrow if possible. So he hands this out to the directors and just says, whoever comes up with a good idea, it's yours. You're going to direct it. And so in 1 week, I and another guy named Len Smith pitched an idea to take this character Bonkers and come up with this short. It's like six to 7 minutes long, and has a very simple concept. For me, because it was going to be a short, it was going to be a kind of an homage to Tex Avery. And considering I only had a week to do it, it was pretty good. The concept. I mean, had I had a month, it could have been so much better as far as an idea for a cartoon. But Gary Kreisel said, it's yours. So we storyboarded it. And ultimately, I would go to Paris and hand it out to them. And they would do a wonderful, wonderful job with it. And it got produced. And it got saddled with a live action movie that Disney was producing. And it came out. And I think a limited number of people saw it because the movie it was connected to was not a big blockbuster. At that time, I don't think Disney they hadn't quite hit their stride yet with movies, live action movies, with the new management and everything. They ultimately would. But the movie was done, and it's a standalone cartoon. The series of Bonkers, the TV series, was totally different. In fact, the cartoon has nothing to do with interacting with live action people. It's like the Roger Rabbit cartoon with Baby Herman. It's just cartoons. And so the idea was that that Bonkers is this cartoon character who is in cartoons, and just like Roger Rabbit would make cartoons, and then there's this whole other existence, and I wasn't focusing on the other existence, I was only focusing on the cartoon. So the short doesn't have that concept problem of having to interact with live action characters that look like cartoons. Ultimately, the series would, and that's why the series was never successful. It was a syndicated show, so we had to do 65 right out of the box. And midway through the production, the concept for it actually changed, and the executive producer changed on it, and a lot of things changed on it. It had a very peculiar production all the way around, and it came out and they aired them, and then it kind of went away, and rightfully so.